Okay, goedemiddag iedereen. Because we have guests, we will hold this session in English, although they know Dutch, both of them. So if you have questions, you can ask them in Dutch. They really can understand it very well. So we invited fellows, from international fellows, to discuss issues around the future of our university with LIAS, or Leuven Institute of Advanced Study. And there were discussions about how you need to organize education. Is it more than just professional education, or is an academic education more than this? That was the subject. Another issue was about innovation. How can universities be helpful in stimulating innovation? And we have also the issue about academic freedom. When we were thinking about developing that team, that was the time where indeed the woke discourse was quite dominant, and there were indeed questions within the university environment where the vulnerability of students could make it impossible to say everything you wanted to say in the academic level. So that was a little bit the idea, to discuss the influence of the woke culture and how to deal with it. That was the initial idea. But then, of course, we had the authoritarian influence. So indeed, in the United States, a lot of universities are threatened to lose their subsidies and their money because they defend certain things, or they propose, so that kind of thing. But there is another kind of thing that is indeed perhaps threatening our academic freedom, which was already existing long before, and that's the issue of commercialization. So indeed, universities get money, but often with a kind of idea that certain things needed to be developed in a particular way. There is the image, there's the public way of how universities present themselves. They want to be competitive on the market, and all these kinds of pressure perhaps are also threatening for academic freedom. And so this is the subject of we will discuss. And Vasiliki Kosta, Vicky Kosta, will explain this. She is from the public law from the University of Leiden. And then Heinze from Queen Mary University of London will react on it. I guarantee you it will be a lively debate. We keep it possible that you can ask the questions, so I give the floor to Vicky.
Well, thank you very much. And let me start by saying this is really a big pleasure and honor to be here with you today, not just today, but in a string of events since last week for me. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks for all the discussions that we've had so far, really insightful. And really thank you also for the excellent organization. Jelle, also to you. You really made us feel like home. So this is the final event for me today, and I really wanted to say how much I appreciated all these days. Indeed, the topic that I want to address in this lunch seminar today is the commercialization challenge. We had an in-depth discussion already on Tuesday on this. So for those of you who were there on Tuesday, apologies for the overlap, but maybe the discussions will go in different directions with different audiences. It's always in the discussions where you get sort of the variation. Indeed, as already mentioned, there are academic freedom challenges that are very obvious to anyone who doesn't study the topic at all. And these illiberal challenges are the ones that we can easily identify as academic freedom challenges. A government that says this university or this scholar doesn't fit with our ideological stance, so we cut the money, or we shut down a department, or we silence an academic. So that's not so difficult to identify. I want to focus on challenges that might be a bit more subtle, a bit more systemic, and therefore maybe a bit more difficult to identify as academic freedom challenges. And they have to do with how the overall system of science and of academia is organized, and the kind of incentives or disincentives that are there and might therefore have a steering capacity. So I will address this topic from the point of view of EU law, to the extent that I will think of academic freedom as an EU legal right. You could have other benchmarks from other legal orders, or you could also have non-legal benchmarks of what academic freedom means. As an EU lawyer, I will have recourse to EU law to think about that. I will focus a bit more on commercialization and only towards the end, very briefly, also address what might be commercialization channels that might emanate from EU law and policy. And perhaps in thinking about this topic, it is useful to start by noting that science is indeed useful. And there's not few reminders today of how useful and how important science is for, on the one hand, the economy. If we look at the Draghi report on the EU competitiveness of September 2024, we can read quite early in the report, first and most importantly, Europe must profoundly refocus its collective efforts on closing the innovation gap with the US and China, especially in advanced technologies. And then a bit further down, we see that universities and other research institutions are characterized as central actors in early stage innovation, generating breakthrough research and producing new skills and profiles for the workforce. So this is really high on the political agenda of today. Science is useful and universities are central actors in delivering this competitiveness agenda. Science is also useful for politics, and the two hang together. The political system, of course, depends on economic growth, especially if we're thinking of welfare systems. So science is therefore also important for politics by means of economic growth being important for the political system. But also, science can be viewed as a source of legitimation for politics. The argument is that in highly complex societies, the steering function of politics relies on this scientifically secured knowledge. And moreover, when decisions have to be made which are particularly controversial, it is kind of useful to say, but you know, based on science, this is a good idea, this decision is something that we should support. And these are not just my ideas, Dieter Grimm has talked about them already in 2006 in a lecture in relation to German Wissenschaftsfreiheit and new frontiers there. And of course, again, high on the political agenda and also on the EU agenda is geopolitics. We have a Council recommendation on enhancing research security of 2024, where it is pointed out that we have growing international tensions and a growing relevance of research and innovation in this new geopolitical landscape. So then we can note that certain types of sciences will be more useful than others at given moments in time for these different societal systems, for economics or for the political system. And they will be useful because they allow these other societal systems, the economy and politics, to fulfill their own purposes. Again, this is all Dieter Grimm. So if we have economic growth based on science, the economic system can fulfill its own purpose. If we have science that allows us to overcome geopolitical tensions, addressing societal problems and so on, the political system can fulfill its own purpose. But the thing is, these purposes are different from the purposes of the scientific system. So the purpose of the scientific system, so the argument goes, is to seek truth. Or if you don't like that term, maybe you like the term knowledge, scientifically secured knowledge that comes through a certain method and engagement with a certain state of the art, and cognition, Erkenntnis. Thank you for the good interpretation of the term Erkenntnis, which I was looking for from the other day. So then, we are in a knowledge-based society, according to social scientists, where both the economy and the political system rely a lot on science and want a lot from science. And at the same time, we live in times where the academic system is being commercialized. And of course, to different degrees in different states. So this doesn't look the same in each member state of the EU or even, in the UK or in the US. So there are variations, but we can identify some trends. What is commercialization? I divide this in 3 elements. The first element is that universities are increasingly behaving like actors on the market. So they engage in market or market-like activities, either in for-profit activities themselves, or they compete with each other as universities or as faculties at the institutional level, department level, and so on, for external money, be it in the form of grants, being in the form of getting students who might then pay certain tuition fees, and so on. So this comes from a strand of literature, academic capitalism it's called, and I borrow the definitions from there. So that's one phenomenon. We see universities acting more like actors on the market. The second element is that universities are organized according to corporate management principles. If you want, you can call it the new public management, the technique that comes from the corporate world, from the private sector, on how to manage undertakings and corporations gets then inserted here in the public higher education sector. So what do we want? We want efficiency, and usually that means cost efficiency. We want to spare resources. We want an audit culture that checks and controls and gives a certain kind of accountability. And with this audit culture, you get, paradoxically, lots of bureaucracy, lots of red tape, lots of reporting in the name of efficiency. You also get the introduction of measurements, measurable indicators. So we want to measure the performance in order to make sure that everyone is functioning effectively. And what is sort of the easiest way, presumably, quantitative is by and large what we see in this new public management approach. And so we find these elements, as I said, to various degrees in different places. And at the same time, we also find a context of cuts in public spending in higher education. So when you have these trends and at the same time you have public spending going down, you have a situation where you find an increased external steering capacity of what the scientific and academic system does. Here are some examples. An increased reliance on external funding acquisition can mean the prioritization of certain disciplines. STEM might be more important in geopolitical times and in times where we need to be more competitive than some small subjects from the humanities, for example. Certain topics might be prioritized, and also certain methodological approaches. The changed university management, according to new public management, measures performance based on a logic that is external to the scientific system itself, and therefore also has a kind of steering capacity that might not come from the logic of the purpose of the scientific system. So of course you publish differently if you need a grant, if you need external money. If you need to publish in certain journals, you will behave differently. You might take lesser risks so that your chances of publishing in certain journals will increase. And of course, you will adjust your scientific activity and you will spend your time differently if you're measured based on how much impact you have achieved with your work, societal impact, economic impact, and so on. And of course, finally, if you have a functional understanding of science, that of course has an inbuilt steering capacity because you understand the scientific system as having the purpose of fulfilling another system's aims. So then, what is the tension between commercialization and academic freedom? In order to answer that, because you may not like commercialization for certain reasons, but what is the tension with academic freedom? You need then to define what academic freedom means. And of course, if you are in certain policy contexts on certain stakeholders that want to protect and promote academic freedom, sometimes you may hear this point that we need a common definition on academic freedom. This is the one problem that prevents us from protecting academic freedom sufficiently. Might be the case, but as a lawyer, I approach it differently. I ask in my specific legal order, what is the concrete legal benchmark? Is there one? Certain things we may know, certain things we might know. For me, for EU law, it is Article 13 of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which protects the freedom of the arts and sciences. It has two short sentences: the arts and scientific research shall be free of constraint, academic freedom shall be respected. Okay, short, not untypical for fundamental rights, but then we need case law defining what that actually means. In EU law, we have one case, the joke keeps repeating itself, the one case that I need to read. We have the Court of Justice that has accepted this Article 13 to include an individual dimension linked to expressive freedoms. And this it has done with reference to the European Convention of Human Rights, Article 10. There has been some case law there already. What does it mean? We have freedom of academic expression, freedom to disseminate information, including teaching, freedom to conduct research, freedom to disseminate knowledge and truth without restriction, intramurally and extramurally. So we have that. And the court said, and also the Advocate General, in this case, Commissioner in Hungary, but academic freedom must be more than that in EU law, because we have Article 10 on freedom of expression, but we also have a separate provision, Article 13 on academic freedom. So it must mean that there is something more to it. And that is the second dimension, the institutional dimension of academic freedom. In this case, the court said, based on Article 13 of the Charter, you cannot deprive universities of their organizational structures. An institutional dimension, according to other legal orders and other accounts, hard law or soft law, can include also more. It can include, for example, the principle of self-governance and the participation of staff, of academic staff, in the decision-making and the governing bodies of the universities, and all kinds of other criteria. So you can think of institutional autonomy as relating to autonomy of the university vis-a-vis the state, so that's external, but also a kind of internal dimension in the form of self-governance, that it's the academics that make collectively the important decisions in the university. But we don't know the details of that yet. So based on this case, we only know about this external dimension. And then thirdly, that there are obligations, positive obligations, resting on the states to protect higher education institutions from threats to their autonomy coming from any source. And here, thinking of autonomy, the court cited the UNESCO recommendation of 1997, which is a soft law instrument, but read it, incorporated into the interpretation of Article 13, saying, autonomy is the institutional form of academic freedom and a necessary precondition to guarantee the proper fulfillment of the functions entrusted, both to higher education teaching personnel and the institutions. So autonomy is there to guarantee the function of what we are supposed to do. So you see again sort of this reference to the purpose of what we are supposed to do. But what is this function? What is sort of this guarantee? In the beginning, I talked about Grimm with reference to the German system, talking about, pursuing scientifically secured knowledge and the pursuance of truth. And if we look at some of the philosophical accounts, sort of theories trying to think about why do we protect academic freedom, actually, this truth-seeking rationale is the most conventionally accepted rationale, that this is the reason why we protect academic freedom, because in fact we want to be able to allow and protect this task, this function of pursuing truth. And that truth-seeking rationale can be understood both as a sort of value in itself for its own sake, but it might also have other functions. And the democratic rationale is the other rationale that is then also discussed in that literature. How does this link? The truth-seeking rationale leads us to securing this knowledge, this scientifically secured knowledge, and that is important for citizens when they have to form their political will. But it's also useful for the democratic political processes so that we don't have arbitrary decision making. So in that sense, it's also useful for democracy. Another argument that is presented here is that academic inquiry exemplifies this rational inquiry needed for democratic deliberation, and students within the university learn that kind of inquiry. They learn this critical thinking that is important for democracies, and this overall creates then a culture of democracy as well. And so then the third sub-argument from democracy is that academics and the academic system can also have a kind of watchdog function. They participate in public debates, they scrutinize public debates. In that sense, they might be acting in certain instances similar to the press or even NGOs. Okay then, so we looked at the fact that we have commercialization, we looked at the benchmark, what is academic freedom, why do we protect academic freedom, and now we have to go a step further and say, what are then the possible tensions between commercialization and academic freedom? And again, I'm not making here a legal analysis of a specific case to say here we have a concrete violation of Article 13 of the Charter, but I'm just giving some illustrations to tease out the tensions. For example, when research agendas are being primarily set by external funding schemes, this can affect the free choices of the researchers. So we have the freedom of research, which includes the freedom to choose the topics and to choose the methods. And so if you have to primarily apply for these external funding schemes and they are tied to certain conditions, that can affect the freedom of research. When management processes and governance processes seek to make the research culture more efficient, to generate more results and more useful results, this actually leads to a situation where the truth-seeking, the critical and original thought might be hampered. It's the example I mentioned before, especially if you think about young academics in precarious positions, in early career positions. They might not take the risks that they would like to take if they have to tick certain boxes, either to get the money or to get a promotion or to make a name for themselves in the university and in the wider culture. Another example, when changed university structures that become more centralized, more hierarchical, and more with outside non-academic leaders at the top and in key positions, that may undermine the principles of self-governance, collegiality, and decision-making, which derives from this institutional dimension of academic freedom, and the general point that if the government sees the universities as the arm of economic policy, then that would hamper the disinterested pursuance of truth. Okay, and then now finally, what are potential commercialization challenges coming from the EU? I'm an EU lawyer after all, and so I have to link that topic up to EU law. When we think of this area, it's again maybe not immediately obvious that EU law is relevant here. Why? The EU does not have a harmonizing competence in education, so different member states have the competence to organize their different educational systems in themselves the way they want. But that doesn't mean that EU law and policy cannot find its way into these national education systems. One quite well-known one is the Bologna process. Here, of course, I have to say that this is not EU law, it's outside the framework of EU law, but the European Commission has been said to have a key role, an influential role, and in disseminating, based on these Bologna processes, a Europe-wide discourse on higher education. And when it acts, also outside strictly of this legal framework in this intergovernmental forum, it is still bound by Article 13 of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. We have also other policy fields, not on education, that can have spillover effects. With impacts on national educational systems. The internal market is the one that principally comes to mind and typically gets cited as having spillover effects. principally because private higher education, in return for remuneration, has been qualified as part of the economic freedoms of the internal market, where internal market law says we have to guarantee the free movement of services and the freedom of establishment. And in fact, these internal market freedoms were actually also at stake in the case Commission in Hungary, where the court adjudicated on Article 13 of the Charter, but first on actually the free movement of services and the freedom of establishment, which in any case it had to, because the EU Charter does not apply to member states always, but only when they act within the scope of EU law, and the internal market was the way in. And then finally, here I have it as on my slide, I have it as a first point, the EU governance framework in research. Here the EU has an explicit competence, and of course it funds research. It has large-scale research programs, and they keep getting bigger with Horizon Europe. But also, interestingly, this is the one development I'm waiting for quite eagerly, is the ERA Act, the European Research Area Act. So the Commission will put forward a proposal for adopting an act to set up and sort of further establish the European research area. And that policy instrument and then legal instrument, once adopted, is viewed as an instrument to also deliver on the Draghi report on the one hand, but on the other hand, there is also an understanding that academic freedom and scientific freedom, as protected in the Charter, has to be also guaranteed. So I'm waiting to see how that balance will be struck in this act. And another reason why I'm waiting eagerly is because it was announced that there will be legislation in this ERA Act, there will be provisions in this legislation further fleshing out the freedom of scientific research at the secondary level. Commissioner von der Leyen announced it at her Sorbonne lecture this June that we will enshrine this scientific freedom in this act. So it's also interesting to see how the legislator will give further meaning to this right. And I will stop there.
Well, for the third time, but very happily, I will repeat my heartfelt thanks for the invitation that I've had over the past few days to come visit here at Leuven and to interact with colleagues. It's been an absolute pleasure and honor as well, and probably more enriching for me than for anyone who's had to listen to me. Not least because whenever Bart speaks, he always says exactly what I wanted to say, and then I need to spend 10 minutes improvising, but I'll do my best. And I mean, I don't have much to add, let alone to criticize in what Vicky has said. And instead what I'd like to do is maybe wrap up some of the themes that have emerged over the past few days, and maybe see if the context can be broadened a little bit. And so first, Vicky, along with Ashish and others, were telling us about pragmatic challenges to the future of universities, measured by their institutional success, their efficiency, driven therefore by factors such as funding, I should say that's a competitiveness, isn't it? Sorry about that. Marketing, and so forth. And again, Vicky has, and as well as Ashish, they've outlined these problems extremely well. And of course, maximizing both social and economic utility within society, therefore become important benchmarks for whether universities should be funded, for how well they're doing, and any number of other metrics. At the same time, right, as Bart pointed out, joined up with these pragmatic challenges are ideological challenges, which have to do with the broader role of the university within a democratic society, or with whatever we have left of our democratic societies. And the ongoing problem, I think, whether the university should be a kind of microcosm of the broader society, reflecting all of its ugliness, all of its strife, all of its contradiction, all of its controversy, or whether it needs to be a kind of a paragon, whether it needs to sort of set a higher moral tone, set an example for the rest of society, almost as a kind of ivory tower or enclave. And over the past few days, I've been arguing very much against that, because I think this has very much been the dominant idea for a long time, of the university as kind of charged with, tasked with becoming a better kind of community to lead the way for the rest of society. And I have big questions about whether this works, not least of all because in practice it has often meant censoring a lot of speech. And so to broaden out the context a bit, I would say that since, certainly since the Cold War, post-World War II period, you can say there's been a kind of revolution in education, reflecting a certain revolution in culture. And reflecting a kind of revolution in the way we understand concepts of history and historical justice, right? If we think about the kind of educations that our parents or grandparents might have had, right? History was, you might say, the high deeds of great men, right? So history meant you start with Alexander the Great, and then you go to Julius Caesar, and then all the way through, maybe a bit of Charlemagne, Louis XIV, Charles de Gaulle, you go, all right, the whole list, right? The battlefields, the palaces, the parliaments, right? After World War II, this model, this paradigm of history has been very much reversed, indeed revolutionized. Today, and nowhere more than in the university, history means that fundamentally a critique of that whole tradition, right? That you are not simply morally incorrect, you're almost incompetent if you do history that way, right? And history has to be fundamentally, right, understanding several centuries of the history of Western liberal democracy as unjust, as structurally and systemically unjust, right? So history has to consist largely through critiques of centuries of capitalism, militarism, colonialism, racism, patriarchy, heteronormativity, and so forth. And I think that's good. I think that's maybe one of the finest achievements of progressive educational and progressive politics since World War II. I think through this understanding of history as collective self-scrutiny, history as collective self-critique, is something we've never seen anywhere before. I mean, most societies on the planet still don't do history this way. Most societies on the planet, right? I mean, certainly if you look at Russia, China, they don't do any of this. This is not how history is taught. It's still the high deeds of great men, right? And anything like this will get you thrown in prison. And so I think we should be very proud, and this is largely, the way I do teach. But I think we've been too inattentive to the costs. I think that these patterns of and I don't mean to, incidentally, just to be clear, I'm not talking only about what happens in history departments. It happens in all departments, right? Well, okay, I won't talk too much about the natural sciences, although even there. but I mean in psychology and sociology and literature and philosophy, all of these are now expected to be suffused with what I'm calling the radical critique of Western liberal democracy. I mean, I've even spoken to psychologists who say that, you know, a white male sitting in a clinic with a psychologist can only be there because he has failed to understand his situation of privilege. So this kind of historiography, but again, which pervades the disciplines, I think goes very much hand in hand with what we could call a kind of Cold War relativism, which was indeed very much the cradle of what we today call international human rights. Don't tell this to international human rights people, of which I'm one, by the way. They don't like to hear this, right? The internationalization of human rights during the Cold War was very much about there are certain standards that must apply to everyone equally, regardless of political system. That makes no sense. What would that mean? I mean, if you only have to look at the Universal Declaration, not to mention all the others, to see that none of this can be done regardless of political situation. And yet, at the United Nations, this is still the way they think about human rights. This is still the way human rights are taught pretty much everywhere, right? The idea that human rights kind of hover above politics. And therefore, there's a certain way in which and this is a very Cold War way of thinking, well, who's to say really that Western liberal democracy is better than the Soviet Union, right? One has its strengths and weaknesses, the other has its strengths and weaknesses, right? Who are we to judge? You know, look at all the terrible things the West has done, the capitalism, militarism, colonialism, right? And so forth, right? Who's to say really? You know, they each have their pluses and minuses. Human rights are still done this way at the United Nations. Right, with this kind of false veneer of the apolitical, when it's nothing but politics. And we would do much better to think, well, then, which political system do human rights actually presuppose? Because I think that there's still a lot of misunderstanding about that. And I think this also informs very much the way our academies, the way our universities have evolved with a very similar kind of cultural relativism, right? I mean, it goes back to the Frankfurt School, the idea that liberal democracy is, or, you know, can be just as bad as any kind of autocracy, right? We got all of this through Horkheim and Adorno and Habermas, and again, often quite brilliantly. I don't mean to be dismissive of these insights, but once again, I ask, have we been too inattentive to the costs, right? Because this is still part of our world today. That bit of the Cold War we have not shaken off, and certainly not, it's least of all in universities, if you kind of stand up today in many university settings and deliver a full-throated defense of Western liberal democracy, you're going to be laughed at. Whereas if you stand up and say, oh, you know, you're not looking at actually what's good in Iran or China, you're going to get loads of applause. Sometimes. Maybe I'm exaggerating a bit, but not much. And as Bart so rightly pointed out, which is why I'm having to improvise, right? The far right also in funding and so forth, right, is little by little also eroding our understanding of our faith in Western liberal democracy. So it's coming, and often in very much the same ways. Remember, Carl Schmitt 100 years ago, Martin Heidegger 100 years ago, were attacking Western liberal democracy in ways that, in fact, you know, many so-called progressive pretty much incorporated wholesale. And so it's still coming from both sides, more at the institutional level, right, where the far right wants to make incursions into funding. Obviously, in the United States, we've been seeing appalling examples, but in Germany, they just can't wait. The AfD is quite clear about this, right? I mean, just yesterday in Parliament, in the German Parliament, in the Bundestag, one of them got up and was pretty much announcing a Trumpist view of defunding, based essentially on ideology, the present German government doesn't really understand democracy, right? Which is very much what we've had also from the left. And so, I say, along with Mercutio, a pox on both their houses, and would propose, just in case you think I'm only criticizing and offering no solution, I think we have to go back to what people like Adorno and Horkheimer originally had, and Hannah Arendt, I should mention here, originally had in mind, which was that if we're going to move forward from where we are now, critical theory, and I mean this broadly, as we see it in history, in philosophy, in sociology, in psychology, in anthropology, in literature, and on, it has to go back to the critique of all discourses of power, of all structures of oppression. It should be concerned with oppression as the enemy of democracy, and not simply particular critiques of Western liberal democracy. I guess a very good example of what counts today as critical theory would be we could describe as discourse analysis, right? This means that, in other words, we look at power hierarchies in society today: racism, sexism, heteronormativity, right? Colonial relations, and so forth. And we look at how discourses of liberal democracy, freedom, autonomy, equality, and so forth are deployed not to combat, but to entrench and to justify existing relations of power, right? This is, I think, is core to the enterprise of many critical theoretical schools. Again, I'm fine with that. I teach that too. What we have still not seen in 100 years of critical theory across the disciplines are critical theorists applying that same discourse analysis to themselves. How have my own discourses been appropriated in the service of some of the most oppressive and murderous regimes of the past 100 years? There is no such thing in our universities today. I mean, zero. And so I'll finish up with how I started last Thursday. If we go to, right, if we think about some of the raging controversies in our society today, right, the ones that have us most polarized, it could be the Gaza war. It could be trans people's rights, for example. We would expect that we can go first to the university to hear the debates, to hear this being discussed in a rigorous and honest and straightforward way. And instead, today, the university is the last place you go to hear any of this. It's completely off limits. We get lots of rallies. We get lots of rallies and jamborees. What we don't get, or at least not nearly enough, almost not at all, as far as in my experience, in the UK, is a genuine, honest, balanced, multifaceted debate about these sorts of issues. Instead, the one you don't like gets boycotted, protested, the debate is always shut down. So what is the point of a university then? So as I was telling some of my colleagues on Tuesday, I've scribbled a little bit about some of this in a recent book that just came out last spring. Thank you very much.
For questions, the micro will come to you for the recording. Philippe Abraham.
Imagine that you are, that's the third time, that you are in a leading position at the university. And you want, on the one hand, try to make sure that your university performs well in whatever measures that you find important, which means also allocating resources and so on. And the other aspect is you want to protect academic freedom. What would be your do and don'ts in that case?
So I think the problem is that university rectors and deans and so on find themselves in a structure where the cards are already somehow stacked against you if you're in a highly commercialized system. But at the same time, there are also certain things that are self-imposed. Because this idea of, having to participate in the rankings, having to, like that, show that you're a good university, maybe it's not really, there's no law that says that, but it's an internalized kind of ideology. And there have been universities that said, we're not participating in these rankings anymore. We are not. We don't think it's evaluating properly the quality, the substance of what we are doing. So, they're nice that Times Higher Education and all kinds of rankings exist, but we don't do it. And so I think when the problem is systemic and structural, when there is room to act, what you need is awareness, sort of, again, an open debate and sort of a reflection on what the structures are, what is the room of maneuver, and then within that, collective action helps. I think, if all the universities were to come together and say, these ranking systems, they don't represent us. It's not what we do. Let's not do it altogether. You could change things. But you need, again, I think then we come also back to it, you need to discuss these things. You can't just assume, internalize, and think of you being in a position that you don't have any other alternative when in fact you do, but you have to sort of find these places and then coordinate also. I think that would be my approach. Of course, if you have laws in place, then it's different, right? If you only get funding if you do this, then it's hard, because how are you not going to do the things that give you the money to allow you to operate? So sometimes there will be hard decisions to be made because you don't have room of maneuver, but then you can also problematize that within the university and in the public as well through other fora. Right? Is it through Royal Academies? Is it through a League of European Research Universities? Like these fora where you can actually have a collective voice and say, we as an academic community think this is detrimental to the academic community.
Yeah, one thing we've been discussing over the past few days, university administrators want a quiet life. When they don't want big campus controversies with lots of negative media coverage, certainly they don't want violence erupting, they don't want police having to come onto campus, they don't want to hear complaints from parents, and so they have, are you a university administrator?
I was.
Oh, okay. I should have asked that first. And so there have been several examples, I mean, certainly in Britain, but elsewhere as well, where they're just very tempted to invoke a security rationale, right? They see a controversy brewing and they say, well, we need to protect people, we don't want violence, and so we're going to cancel event A or B or C. right, for purposes of safety. This is what governments do. And what's lovely about that pretext is that nobody can really challenge it because they're talking about resources. People may challenge it, but that's a question of resources, that's a question of budgets, and questions of how budgets are spent, yeah, you can always argue about them. And so in that respect, university administrators always have a trump card. No pun intended. And this is one reason why, over the last few days, I've been urging very much against this very paternalistic and protective model, which, as I was saying, this idea of the campus as the moral paragon, right, as the better self for the rest of society. My preferred model is that the university should, as much as possible, not restrict speech any more than the law of the land requires, and at times might even need, in some ways, to challenge what the law of the land is. Because again, it's just as it's tempting to invoke security rationales, it's tempting to invoke moral rationales. We, as an academic community, cannot allow such and such a terrible speaker. And I think it's just too easy, right, for not only for administrators, by the way, you'll hear this from the mouths of students if they don't like a certain speaker. Say, we as a community cannot allow, right, this one speaking for the whole, as if an academic community is a unified whole. It never was, and it probably shouldn't be, at least no more than the greater society is. Rather, we should see the divisions, the ugliness, the filth of society reflected in the university, which, of course, is not easy to manage, I concede.
Thank you very much for I will first self-declare, I'm one of the vice rectors of this university, so for science, engineering, and technology. So first two remarks. The point that you make on the rankings, I can really say that in our university, the rankings have no influence on any policy. So that is one brief point. And the second is also, I think, in the past years, we have never canceled any talk or conference or workshop or restricted any expression in terms of freedom of speech. So also that point, if you have other information, we can discuss this, but I really don't think so. But then I do have a question for both of you, and it connects to what Philip Abraham was saying. I think, as usual in these kind of things, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. We do need this kind of industrial funding that is based on competitiveness. Industry will put their money where it delivers something. And if I look at the budget of our university, I think it's fair to say that the way the money comes in this way is actually used to also fund themes and subjects that don't attract the money in the same way. So we actually need both. Thank you.
To that, first, maybe you want to go after. My expose was not to say that the universities shouldn't collaborate with private industry. Certainly not. Absolutely, they should, and it's necessary sometimes. As you say, they can be fruitful, also for scientific reasons. The industry might have the infrastructure, the data, all kinds of resources that a university just cannot have. So that's not the point. The point is, maybe there's 2 points here. One is, once you enter in this collaboration, they have to be science adequate. So you have to make sure that you have guarantees in place that, secure academic freedom, scientific freedom, and so on. And, there's different cases where situations can be abused. And maybe that's the second point. If you don't have sufficient baseline public funds and you are overly reliant on that money, the risk of abuse becomes bigger. So this is all, I would say on this point. So my expose again was not to say that it's always bad or never good, but you have to look at the big picture and to say, okay, under these conditions, it might be more risky, and what are sort of the safety guarantees? Yeah.
you give me hope, and I sincerely congratulate this commitment, but that's a very important and meaningful exposition of a formal or official policy. The problem is that enormous amounts, probably the majority of censorship takes place informally and probably below your level, right? Through social pressures. Here again, the Gaza conflict is a perfect example. I've seen countless examples where people actually would have liked to have heard the Israeli side too, but you just can't do it. Yeah? And it doesn't get to senior administration, right? Particularly if you're, you know, if you want a promotion within your department, depending on the department, you're just not going to do it. Or if you want to be invited to conferences and so forth, right? Or the other example I was giving would be, you know, journals. It could be even a mathematics or a cell biology journal, right? Which has a policy of no submissions from an Israeli, right? You might not even know it's happening. And we're hearing more and more, I mean, we've seen this for a long time. Another thing that I wanted to say is you as an administrator can't talk about a we, but this we never really exists, right? This is why I was trying to explain the other day, when we're talking about this kind of no platforming, this sort of censoring of speech, it's one faction within the university against another, you know? So one group of students, or maybe staff, want to invite a certain speaker, another group, they don't like it, they start getting the protests going, right? And so even if you're having this faction, which is militating against free speech, yeah, this is already a real concern, you know, and it might be something you can do nothing, you can't force them, obviously, right? So, you know, I'm glad about this commitment. If anything, I would be even more vocal about it. Yeah.
So in your other speeches, you were talking about these fractions of different kinds of fractions of people. Yeah. You were mentioning 3% and the other 3%, but you have the 94, indeed. 94 other students. Also, when you're talking about we need to unite, we need to have these kinds of discussions, I like this indeed. What we are doing during this lunch debate is indeed invite everyone of our university to discuss about academic freedom. But I wonder if this is 3% of our university. So there seems to be a problem nowadays. If we were in the years 68, that was a complete other time. The students were very discussing with each other. There was a lot of social movement. Now a lot of students are just not interested in all these kinds of things. They want to succeed for their examination, and if that is all right, no problem. So the most asked question is, do we need to know that for the examination? That seems to be a very fundamental question nowadays. So what to do about that? The fact that a lot of our colleagues are quite inert. They don't want to move, they don't want to discuss, they just want to develop what they are busy with. And the fact that indeed also the students are not quite motivated like they were in the 68.
Maybe this links to commercialization actually. Because if we think of the university as a place where you get your work credential, you want to move fast. If you're in a place that has tuition fees like in the UK that keep increasing, it's very expensive. You're not going to waste your time debating. You're going to think, okay, I might be even in debt now in order to sponsor myself through this. And for me, it's a means to get a good job. And, you know, if that's the portrayal of what this is, you know, if we think of universities for skill, for labor, for credential institutions, if that's what we're portraying on the one hand, and then for scientists, you know, just to survive in this, you know, position where you have to do 4 or 5 different jobs in one, little time, all kinds of things added on top of each other coming from commercialization, like reporting, bureaucracy, you know, performing for your evaluation, societal impact, grant applications, which is like a full-time job in itself, but you have to do in your free time. Yeah, then you suffocate this possibility to create that culture, you know? So for me, they're somehow linked in a way.
question.
I mean, is there a way out? To me, the first step is always awareness raising. And for students, it starts first days in the university, very early on. Who are you? Why are you here? What is your role? Is this just school? Is this just vocational training? Have you reflected about what? This is a unique time in your life. You know, you have possibilities to do things. How are you thinking about what your role is here? And then also, what do you think universities do? What is science? What is academic freedom? How do students participate in those debates as well? I think it starts very early for students. For the time of professors, I don't have a magic solution.
But I would add, I mean, yes, some are really just there for, they just want to get a job, fine. But I think this kind of real hostility toward skepticism about both free speech and democracy itself does create social pressures which do just silence some people, which push people into a default of indifference because, you know, social censure is very difficult, and particularly in the classroom, because I'm talking about pressures that students put on other students, but not only about those. Instructors do this too, right? There have been plenty of instructors who in one way or another have supported boycotts, right? In other words, and who do create this idea that if you even, forget agree with, if you even attend a speech by a certain controversial speaker, for example, someone who wants to challenge trans rights, right? Or someone who, or an Israeli ambassador, as I said the other day, or whatever it is, right? Then that makes you complicit. Even on the trans issue, by the way, I've literally been present when someone, a feminist who was simply raising some questions, was accused of being complicit in genocide of trans people, right? And let alone the Gaza, right? Where, right? And so, you know, so this concept, this demonizing of people who want to involve themselves in free speech, but not in the approved way, might also account for at least some of the seeming complacency. Some of these people might actually want to jump into the debate, but not on those terms. They want genuine debate, you know, right? And they, you know, they don't want to be demonized. And I think, unfortunately, we're just seeing this more and more.
I was just wondering whether maybe we are too harsh for university because it may be a societal problem. And no. But I was wondering whether the link between your two talks isn't the fact that we don't understand what diversity is, diversity as pluralism. For in the managerial thing, if I come from a legal background, if I'm looking what legal scholars in the 70s did, that is amazing. Some only wrote case annotations in Dutch, but they were, many of them, and they were brilliant. And others would publish in German things you wouldn't understand, and they would say, but it's brilliant. And it was diverse, it was pluralist, it was amazing, but it must have been hell for administrators to compare. So the solution is go for one model, 10,000 words, 20 pages in an English language, every word can count. We have standardization. It's easy if you that's your talk. Your discussion is about, I have a model and I'm not agreeing with it, so I'm very critical. I want to be more diverse. I don't want history to be about great men, it should be more. That's diversity, it's end. Right? But that's not how it is conceived. It is replace one dominant model for another one. That's even what we have at lunches. There is no more meat. I'm a president of well, there's no more meat. So I mean, because the vegan, it should be more. The vegetarian, the choice should be broader. No, they replaced one model for another. And here I have exactly the same thing. And this is what our society does, and that's why it's a kind of ideology of let's see how pluralist, how tolerant we are, but we do not tolerate anything else but our own critical narrative. And here I'm going to be very mean, because I've always been a little bit suspicious about, I mean, I think this critical theory is very valuable, but there is a limit to that. And I always wondered, you referred to Horkheimer, to Adorno, but they could have gone everywhere when the Nazis came into power. But how they went to the United States, because apparently it's much more comfortable to be critical for a model in a comfortable country than in Moscow, right? Pierre Bourdieu, I have a personal issue with Pierre Bourdieu. Pierre Bourdieu spent his lifetime saying how elitist l'école républicaine was. The only way Pierre Bourdieu could be where he got, coming from an extremely poor family in France, was thanks to l'école républicaine. That's not to say that you should not be critical for l'école républicaine, but maybe there should be the three children, by the way, of Pierre Bourdieu then followed his father's theory and became professors at the EHSS. So the theory was correct.
I think you would agree, but we are a little bit over our time. So if it's fine, we close the session here. Thank you very much for your attendance, and it was a nice discussion.